It may be easy for you to engage in activities like playing video games or browsing social media on your phone for several hours without losing focus, but you may find it challenging to motivate yourself to spend even a short amount of time studying or working on your side business. Despite knowing that engaging in productive activities like studying, exercising, or building a business can bring long-term benefits, you may still prefer to watch TV, play video games, or scroll through social media. It's clear why some people may find it easier to engage in activities like playing video games or using social media compared to activities that require effort and focus, like studying or working on a side project. However, some people seem to consistently be motivated to tackle difficult tasks. This raises the question, what causes some individuals to be more motivated to do difficult things? And is there a way to make challenging tasks feel more manageable? To understand the answer to this question, we need to examine the role of the brain neurotransmitter dopamine. While dopamine is often thought of as a pleasure molecule, it actually plays a key role in desire and motivation. It is dopamine that drives us to pursue the things we desire, giving us the motivation to take action. To illustrate just how powerful dopamine can be, consider the following experiments conducted by neuroscientists on rats. In these experiments, electrodes were implanted in the brains of rats. When the rats pulled a lever, the researchers stimulated their reward system in the brain, causing the rats to develop a strong craving for the reward. The rats became so motivated to pull the lever that they would do so for hours on end, even neglecting their basic needs for food and sleep. These experiments demonstrate the powerful role that dopamine plays in driving our motivations and desires. The experiment showed that the rats became extremely addicted to the lever that released dopamine, to the point where they would neglect their basic needs such as sleep and food. They would continuously press the lever until they collapsed from exhaustion. However, when the researchers blocked the release of dopamine in the rats' brains, they became lethargic and lost all motivation, including the desire to eat or mate. Even the prospect of getting up for a drink of water was not worth the effort for them. Despite this, if food was placed directly in their mouths, the rats would still eat and enjoy it. This suggests that the rats had lost their will to live, but retained their ability to experience pleasure. Motivation to take action often comes from our basic needs, such as hunger or thirst, but it can also be influenced by the brain chemical dopamine. Studies on rats have shown the impact of dopamine on motivation, and similar effects can be observed in humans. The amount of dopamine released by an activity can determine how motivated we are to repeat it. If an activity releases a low amount of dopamine, we may not feel motivated to do it, but if it releases a high amount, we may feel a strong desire to repeat it. Dopamine is released when we anticipate a potential reward from an activity. If we don't expect any rewards from an activity, our brain won't release dopamine. For example, our brain may release dopamine before we eat comfort food because we anticipate that it will make us feel good, even if it ultimately has negative effects on our well-being. This is because the brain seeks out experiences that release high amounts of dopamine, regardless of the potential consequences. An example of this is someone who is addicted to drugs, even though they know the drug use is harmful to their health. Substances like cocaine and heroin release abnormal amounts of dopamine, leading to increased cravings for these substances. It's important to note that all activities release some amount of dopamine, even something as simple as drinking water when you're thirsty. However, the highest dopamine release occurs when we unexpectedly receive a reward. An example of this is playing a slot machine in a casino, where we continue to play even if we have been losing money, because we anticipate the possibility of a big win. In today's digital world, we are constantly exposing our brains to high levels of dopamine through various sources, even if we are not aware of it. Activities that release high levels of dopamine include scrolling through social media, playing video games, and watching internet pornography. These activities give us the anticipation of receiving a reward, which is why we may constantly check our phones or engage in these behaviors. This can lead to a pattern of seeking out new dopamine hits, similar to a rat pulling a lever for a reward. While this may seem harmless, it's important to consider that our bodies have a natural system called homeostasis, which aims to maintain a balanced level of internal physical and chemical conditions. Homeostasis is the body's natural process of maintaining balance by adapting to changes in its internal environment. For example, when it's cold outside, our body temperature may fall and we may start shivering to generate heat and warm the body. On the other hand, when it's hot outside, our body temperature may rise and we may start sweating to cool down. Homeostasis also manifests itself through tolerance, as seen in the example of someone who drinks alcohol regularly needing to consume more in order to feel the same effects as someone who rarely drinks. The body has developed a tolerance to the substance. Ultimately, the goal of homeostasis is to maintain a stable internal environment. Just as a person who drinks alcohol regularly needs more of it to feel its effects, our brain can also develop a tolerance to high levels of dopamine. To maintain homeostasis, the brain down-regulates dopamine receptors, meaning that it becomes accustomed to high levels of dopamine and they become the new normal. This can lead to a dopamine tolerance, where activities that don't release as much dopamine may no longer be as interesting or motivating. These activities may seem boring or less enjoyable because they don't provide the same high levels of dopamine as activities that do release it in high amounts. This is why people may prefer engaging in activities that release high levels of dopamine, such as playing video games or browsing the internet over activities that release lower levels of dopamine, like studying or working on a business. Video games, for example, make us feel good and comfortable because they release high amounts of dopamine. However, activities like working hard or reading release lower amounts of dopamine. This can lead to a dopamine tolerance, where people, including drug addicts, who are trying to quit may struggle to adjust to a normal life because normal life does not provide the same high levels of dopamine. They may become like the rats in previous experiments, lacking motivation to do anything without sufficient dopamine release. This can also be seen in people who are addicted to video games, social media, or internet pornography, where their dopamine tolerance becomes so high that they are no longer able to enjoy activities that release lower levels of dopamine. To prevent the development of a dopamine tolerance, it may be helpful to perform a dopamine detox. During a dopamine detox, you can set aside a day to avoid activities that release high levels of dopamine and allow our dopamine receptors to recover. It's important to note that if you are struggling with a drug addiction, it is recommended to seek professional help as you may have a physiological and psychological dependence on the substance. Withdrawal symptoms can be severe and should be managed under the care of a medical professional. During a dopamine detox, you can try to minimize fun and pleasure for one full day by avoiding the use of technology, such as phones and computers, listening to music, and eating junk food. Instead, you can embrace boredom and allow yourself to be alone with your thoughts. You can go for a walk, meditate, reflect on your life and goals, and write down any ideas on a physical piece of paper, rather than using a computer or phone. The goal of a dopamine detox is to remove external sources of pleasure for a short period of time to allow your dopamine receptors to recover. A dopamine detox may seem extreme, but if you are seeking significant and rapid results, it may be necessary to take radical action. During a dopamine detox, you can think of it as a way to reset your expectations and preferences. Imagine that you have been eating at the best restaurant in town for every meal, and as a result those fancy meals have become your new normal. If someone offered you a bowl of plain rice, you may refuse it because it doesn't compare to the meals you are used to. However, if you were stranded on a deserted island and hungry, that bowl of plain rice would suddenly seem much more appealing. A dopamine detox works in a similar way by depriving you of the pleasure you typically receive, making less satisfying activities seem more desirable in comparison. In short, dopamine detox helps by making you so bored that even mundane activities become enjoyable. If you don't want to go to such extremes, you can try a smaller dopamine detox. Choose one day of the week to completely avoid a high dopamine activity, such as constantly checking your phone, playing video games, binge-watching TV, eating junk food, or watching internet pornography. Do this every week for a full day. Although you can still engage in other activities, the behavior you have chosen is not permitted. It is okay to feel a bit bored, as this is the intended effect. By abstaining from this behavior, you are allowing your dopamine receptors to rest and recover from the excessive dopamine that has been stimulating your brain. Boredom can actually motivate you to do other things that you might normally procrastinate on because they do not provide the same dopamine rush. It is beneficial to avoid high dopamine behaviors occasionally or, if possible, altogether. Instead, try to associate dopamine with activities that will truly benefit you. Through my research, I discovered that you can use your current high dopamine activities as motivation to pursue endeavors that provide long-term benefits. In other words, you can use these high dopamine activities as a reward for completing challenging tasks. This is what I do myself. I keep track of all the low dopamine tasks I accomplish, such as cleaning my apartment, practicing the piano, reading books, exercising, creating videos, etc. Once I have completed a certain amount of work, I allow myself to indulge in high dopamine activities at the end of the day as a reward. It is important to note the phrases after and at the end of the day here. If I engage in high dopamine behavior before completing difficult tasks, I will not feel motivated to do the low dopamine work. It is crucial to start with the challenging tasks and then reward myself with high dopamine activities. As an example, I use a reward system to balance my work and leisure activities. For every hour of low dopamine work that I complete, I allow myself 15 minutes of high dopamine leisure at the end of the day. This means that for 8 hours of low dopamine work, I allow myself approximately 2 hours of high dopamine leisure. Keep in mind that these are just my personal ratios and you may want to adjust them to suit your own preferences. It's also important to note that if you're addicted to something that is harmful to your health, you should not use it as a reward. Instead, find a different, healthier reward that you still find rewarding. My guilty pleasure is spending hours on the internet without doing anything else. That's why I have a system to help me manage my addiction. However, even with this system, I still make an effort to take breaks and abstain from activities that release high levels of dopamine. In conclusion, it's possible to make difficult tasks feel easier, but when your brain is constantly receiving dopamine, you may not be as motivated to work on tasks that don't provide the same level of reward. That's why it can be helpful to limit your use of phones and computers, as well as other behaviors that release high levels of dopamine. I highly recommend dopamine detoxing your brain to improve motivation. This involves separating yourself from or reducing your exposure to unnaturally high levels of dopamine. When you do this, everyday tasks that don't provide high levels of dopamine will become more exciting and you'll be able to work on them for longer periods of time. It's important to remember that we all have some level of dopamine addiction, which can be a good thing because dopamine helps motivate us to reach our goals and improve ourselves. The choice is yours when it comes to where you get your dopamine from. Will you choose activities that don't benefit you, or will you work towards your long-term goals to get dopamine? If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button to help my channel grow. This will allow more people to see my content and potentially improve their lives. Thank you for watching and I hope this video made you a better person.